All right. I want to welcome everybody today to this edition of Noisy Reality. And we're going to be exploring a different kind of theme today, outside what we normally look at, which is history, politics, international affairs, the current madness going on in the United States. Um, and we're very happy to have with us today Professor Eleanor Johnson, who is a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. Now, Professor Johnson specializes in late medieval literature, medieval theology, the history of environmental thought, horror, and feminism. She is trained as a medievalist, and she's published several works on the Middle Ages, including Practicing Literary Theory in the Late Middle Ages, Ethics and the Mixed Form in Chaucer, Gower, Usk, and Hoccleve. I guess I got that right. Uh,
Mouthful.
yeah, that's a big title there. Dramatizing Contemplation, Participatory Theology in Middle English, Prose, Verse, and Drama, and Waste and the Wasters, Poetry and Ecosystemic Thought in Medieval England. She has branched out as a scholar, and she is a poet. She's a poetry section editor at Public Books.
Mhm.
She's also written, is this a book you've actually written, a collection of poetry, The Dwell in Her Many Feathered Bones?
Yes, those
Oh,
exist.
very good. And poetry, of course, is absolutely wonderful as a form. But we're going to be talking with her today about her scholarly interest in, I guess, a long time. She teaches classes on horror films, horror, and literature at Columbia University. And she
Mhm.
just has come out with a new book called Scream With Me, Horror Films and the Rise of American Feminism, published by Atria. She's also in the middle of finishing a book called Monstrous Bitch, a
Yeah.
long history of terrifying women that's coming out with from Princeton University Press in fall 2026. So, Eleanor, terrific to have you here today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with you, Jim, and to meet the rest of you.
Okay, well, first of all, let's talk about horror films
Great.
because I want to talk about, and you have lots to say about this. And I sort of prepared for this because I was looking at some of these more recent books about horror films. And of course, what is interesting about your book, just to quickly talk about this, is we're going to be talking about in detail the impact of six films,
Mhm.
their interrelationship with the women's struggle in the United States in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, and frankly to today. Uh, but obviously, film in general always reflects, art in general always reflects the times we live in. One thinks about the impact of Birth of a Nation
Mhm.
when that was released in the period of the First World War, and that created a whole consciousness about the South, about uh, Reconstruction that is pernicious and exists to this day. And
Mhm.
then, of course, we have the question of horror films as a genre, because horror films, science fiction films, dystopian films, zombie films, they have the ability to explore issues that are subversive to us.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you could just wax poetic about your attitudes and film feelings about horror films and their significance. Why should we pay attention to that?
It's a great question. And I couldn't agree with you more, Jim, that, part of what art does is it gives us a capacity and a way of talking about really complex, difficult, ethical, political, philosophical, and social dynamics when sometimes either those issues are so pressurized that nobody can get a good sort of leverage on a topic to have a clear conversation. And sometimes when a given topic is not yet fully enough digested by a culture, that there is like a critical vocabulary somebody can use to talk about these topics. That's where art comes into the breach and can do really, really powerful work. And you're right, I'm trained as a medievalist. So I kind of came up studying the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, which is one of the most important works of social philosophy in the history of the English language. And it's also a comedic romp, right? It's doing many different things. So literature, art, they do the work of helping us analyze our own social problems, social ills, social changes. That's true of art broadly. What I think makes horror especially interesting, and this is true of horror across all periods of time that I've ever worked on, and I've worked on, ancient Mesopotamia through now. So I've pretty much covered the whole period of written history. What horror does that's a little bit different and special is horror speaks to our minds through our bodies, right? When you watch a comedy, you might be laughing, but you don't sort of go home feeling like everything around you is hilarious. When you watch a horror film, the horror kind of gets its hooks in your mind, gets its hooks in your affect, your heart, your emotions, and your body, so that on the way home, the world does look a little bit more scary, right? This is this concept I talk about a lot in Scream With Me, the book, the concept of the horror hangover. Horror as a genre sticks to the mind in a way that other literary and filmic genres do less so. Not to say not at all, but they stick less, right? The classic way to think about what horror does to you is, you come home from watching the horror movie at the theater and you kind of want to leave the lights on as you go to bed overnight because you feel a little bit like off kilter, you feel a little bit unsafe. So that like fear factor of horror is a bit contagious. It gets into the audience, it gets into the viewer, and it affects us. And part of what makes that sort of modality powerful as a political tool is that when we feel a little bit afraid, we feel a little bit vulnerable. And we feel a little bit vulnerable, or when we practice feeling vulnerable to certain kinds of things that we see on screen, it gives us a way of imagining our way into the experience of another person. And that can happen in a whole host of different ways, right? And in the book, Scream With Me, I'm talking a lot about how classic mainstream horror films between 1968 and 1980 invited Americans, not necessarily just female Americans, but Americans broadly, into the experiential realms of these female protagonists, like Rosemary from Rosemary's Baby or Chris McNeil from The Exorcist, and invited audiences to feel, to participate imaginatively and bodily in the fear that is experienced by the protagonists of that film. And so horror, because it affects not only our kind of mind and our affect, but also our bodies, it gives us a physiological response. It's very intensely empathogenic, which is to say it triggers an empathic response in an audience that's very deep and pretty durable, like over time. Like I saw The Shining first when I was like 10 in the middle, literally in the middle of a blizzard alone in my house. And
Hmm.
I mean to tell you that if I think about Jack, I'm like an adult human being with an intact rational capacity. I know that Jack Nicholson is not outside my door. But if I think hard enough about some of the scenes in that film, my heart rate goes up a little bit, right? Because the vulnerability is sticky, it stays, you get this hangover, it lingers with you. And that power that horror has makes it really politically powerful, right? Because it's one thing to watch a documentary film. Maybe that stays with you forever. And if so, that's an extremely successful documentary film, right? But when you watch a horror movie, that fear, your sense like, wow, Rosemary's life really does suck. Like what happened to her really was horror. And I'm going to take that home with me and be a little bit afraid at home, or like watching The Exorcist and watching all the harm that's done to the characters of Reagan and Chris, you carry that a little bit home with you. You feel a little bit creeped out in your own home. So I think that horror invites us to practice an empathic vulnerability that is an intrinsic political good. That doesn't mean that all horror films are trying to do political work. They're not, as I'm sure, and in fact, I know in your case, Jim, you and I have both seen a lot of schlocky horror films that aren't doing a whole lot of political anything, right? But the capacity is there. And I think we've seen it a lot in the 21st century. To me, one of the more interesting genre shifts that's taken place in the 21st century is that horror, writ large, has gone from being like schlocky but intermittently really, really smart to being primarily really, really smart. Horror has become a sort of smart, thinky, political, philosophical genre oftener than not. And I could rattle off
Oh, yeah.
example after example after example after example of that, but I won't. I'll instead just give like a couple of highlights, one of which would be everything Jordan Peele has ever done, right? Jordan Peele has realized that the horror genre is a really interesting mechanism for exploring vulnerability with a racialized lens, right? Just as people like Roman Polanski and Friedkin in the 70s were thinking, oh, horror is a really interesting way of exploring female vulnerability, vulnerability that's based on sex and gender. And we're seeing more and more of that. Julia Ducournau, French director, her films like Titan and Raw are also really thinking about sexual vulnerability of women, gender-based vulnerability of women, and trans people. So horror has increasingly become uh, mobilized by filmmakers as a mechanism for getting audiences to imagine their way into the experiential vulnerabilities of other people, with the hope, I think, of doing real political work and asking, provoking real political thoughts and questions.
Hmm.
So
Well,
I
that's
think it's
interesting.
a great genre.
No, that's interesting you raise that because I think about, let's say, when you see movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, when they're first coming
Yeah,
in the middle of depression. Okay, so they're coming in a situation where everybody's in a state of real horror, unemployment's large, and
totally.
and these are incredible successes.
Hmm.
And it was and I was sparked by listening to you and Jeremy Dobner, your colleague, talk about all this, going back into exploring myself. When did these genres start to have an effect? Which I was surprised that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was made into a play in New York City in the 1820s, as early as
Yes.
that. And the whole vampire plays that occur had a pop again. Audience reception, I do not know, but nevertheless, they speak to something. Now let's look at before we get into your great book, the kind of themes we've seen since 911. Uh, I would look at the sort of horror films that came after 911. The
Hmm.
Americans are always the victims in those movies. They are, as opposed to, non-Americans. There's a whole bunch of them that came out after 911. And then you have movies that speak to our political environment, such as the Purge franchise,
Hmm.
which, the latest one is sort of the Trumpists decide to do the purge. Um, and I'm just curious how you're seeing Hollywood interact with our reality right now and how women's roles in particular have changed in this phenomenon. Because one thing that always amazes me when you look at the slasher movies, when you go back to the Freddy franchise, I remember watching it and I said, well, wait, the virgin goddess female is the one who kills the monster.
Right.
And that gets back into sorts of things that you have explored as a scholar, almost subliminal mythology,
Hmm.
going back into the period of several thousands of years.
Yeah.
And so what do you make of how this contemporary art is dealing with women and interpreting their role in a very different way?
Great question. There's a bunch of things that I want to say in response to that, but I'll try and be succinct. So, first of all, I totally agree with you. There's been this uptick in kind of hyper political or self-consciously, explicitly political horror since 9/11. I think that correlates with the sort of the simultaneous rise of the zombie
Yeah, the
genre,
zombies. Yeah, of
like
course.
a genre of great art. Because I mean, I'm sure we all remember zombie movies up until like about 2007 with I Am Legend were pretty schlocky. Like there were some exceptions, Romero's Night of the Living Dead, not a schlocky film, serious art film, serious racial subtext, very important political film. But like Sam Raimi's movies, I love those movies, but they're just nasty, right? And there's others in that vein too. But the zombocalypse genre became really big in the wake of 9/11, and it's partially, and I'm actually writing a book about this now, about zombie art and what zombie art is really doing over time. Part 9/11, one of the things that happened then wasn't just that the towers fell, but as those of us who lived in New York may remember, there was the anthrax scare, right? Where people were just like afraid to open their mail because maybe they were going to inhale anthrax particles, right? So there was this idea of this diffuse, highly contagious pathogen that everyone was like triggered about. And that's the moment at which the zombie genre evolved
Mm.
from being caused by something other than germs to always caused by germs, right? Like from the zombocalypse is almost always virogenic ever since then. An interesting exception, of course, is The Last of Us, in which it's mycogenic. It's created by a fungal infection, but it's still the idea that the individual body is somehow porous to this like exogenous germ threat. And I think that has everything to do with 9/11. So you're totally right that like that really was like a tipping point in many ways for various trajectories that the horror genre was on at that time, and that horror started to get more sort of intellectual and philosophical in the wake of 9/11, which of course was like a major, major event that made Americans feel vulnerable in a way that they had never really felt vulnerable before that time, except maybe in the immediate wake of something like Pearl Harbor, right?
Mm.
Which was still removed enough from the mainland that I would say like the average Chicagoan was probably not panicking about their personal safety in the wake of Pearl Harbor. Whereas I would venture to say that the average Chicagoan in the wake of 9/11 was absolutely freaking panicking about their personal safety. So I think, in the wake of 9/11, the sort of like apocalyptic horror genre really got off the ground, and it stayed off the ground ever since then because it's speaking to a very robustly attested social fear we have about our own individual bodily vulnerability as an artifact of our government's misconduct. So that's thing one.
Yeah.
Thing two, I would say, regarding gender, right? Like women's rights in this country have undergone very interesting and unstable perturbations since forever, but like acutely since the 1970s. Women were doing pretty well in a lot of the late 1970s in particular, into the 80s. And then it's kind of been like a little bit of a sine wave since then. And now we're falling off a cliff, which sucks. I will just say that as a human female. But I think that part of what we've seen happening in the horror genre, broadly speaking, with respect to women in the 21st century, is there's been this interesting phenomenon. Actually, my newest book, Monstrous Bitch, the one that Princeton is bringing out in the fall, is exactly about this. So starting in about, it's really right about the year 2000, like I would sort of say that the movie Ginger Snaps is like really kind of the beginning of this subgenre. There have been a lot of horror films, many of them very gory and sort of culty, not high budget, not fancy, not necessarily mainstream art, that have shown female monsters as protagonists.
Mm,
So there's like ever since Babylon, we've had horror art that has demonized women. It's extremely well attested,
mm,
right? The witch hunts, the actual historical witch hunts in the Euro-American, that was about that, the demonization of women, right? Women who talk too loud, women who sleep around, women who do things that the state doesn't like. They're witches, they're monsters, they die. What's new in the 21st century is we're still getting a lot of horror art about monstrous women, but in the last 25-ish years, often the women's monstrosity is coded as something to root for or as protagonistic in one way or another. The movie Ginger Snaps is somewhat, particularly if you look at the whole franchise of Ginger Snaps, that's a dynamic in the franchise. The movie Teeth is very much like that. Jennifer's Body is very much like that. The movie The Witch, which, as you know, Jim, is like one of my favorite movies of all time, is very much in that genre. The Alien movies are kind of a progenitor of that in some ways, even though Ellen Ripley is not monstrous in the first film. She does actually become monstrous in later films, and she kind of retains her protagonistic status. So I think what's really interesting that's going on, broadly speaking, in horror that's about women now is that we're seeing female monstrosity become compatible with heroism, and that's new.
mm.
And I think that's great. Like that's a direction I couldn't possibly be more delighted with. You still do see tons of like reflexively misogynist monsterizing of women also. I don't think that's ever going to be out of vogue in Western culture, to be totally honest. But we're seeing now this idea that a woman can be monstrous and scary and still someone we're rooting for. The most, in some ways poignant example of that actually is the massively successful Netflix franchise Stranger Things. Have y'all seen that character, that like 11-year-old character named 11? She's a monster. She blows stuff up with her mind, but she's also our protagonist, and she's a protagonist kind of throughout. So that series is very symptomatic of this emergence of monsterized women whom we nevertheless like and root for, not in spite of their monstrosity, but in fact, in part because of their monstrosity. So that's a trend that I'm really interested in and have been paying a lot of attention to lately. And it's not just an American thing. You get that in French horror, a little bit in sort of Mexican, South American horror also. There's a great, I think it's a Guatemalan film called La Llorona that came out a few years ago, in which the monstrous main character is also clearly the protagonist of the film. So that's something that I think is happening in a pretty interestingly kind of transnational way. My favorite example of that genre, actually the most thought-provoking of all to me, there's a wonderful zombie film actually called The Girl with All the Gifts. If any of you have not, it's an excellent, excellent film. And it centers on a female, young, like prepubescent protagonist who is a zombie human hybrid. And she is very monstrous, very aggressive, and very scary, and capable of love, capable of forming relationships, and is absolutely without question our like empathic link into the film. And I think we're going to see more and more of that over the course of the next 20 years or so. Movies about monstrous women who are also still our heroes. And actually, I haven't yet seen the Maggie Gyllenhaal new Frankenstein movie, Bride, but dollars to donuts, it goes in exactly that direction.
Mm. Yeah, when you mentioned I always laugh because my mother, when she taught at Sarah Lawrence, I remember she came in one day in 1957 or so, and we're watching Bride of Frankenstein, which she made a big. She started. I was still getting very scared at those movies at the time, and she
Sure.
basically spoofed it. She started to imitate like the Bride of Frankenstein and like made me laugh real hard. So after that, I guess I lost the fear of those movies.
Yeah.
But that's a long time ago. Now, one thing that's interesting about all these films, and also want you to just before we get into Scream with Me, the question of these dystopian films,
Yeah.
question of the zombie films, but how the family is. I just watched last night Greenland, which
Oh
is
yeah.
which is a movie with basically about the destruction of mankind. And
Hmm.
these movies have been, I mean, you could teach a course. You have the schlocky movies in the 50s like this, and then
Hmm.
you have them get more sophisticated as time goes on. But one thing I find interesting in all these films, including the zombie films, is the question of family. That
Yeah.
ultimately you only have the loved ones that are close to you. And even if you make up a new kind of family, if you're gay, because that's
Hmm.
the other thing that's fascinating about these different genres, they explore different combinations of family and love. And,
Yes, definitely.
and that's sort of interesting too. So what's your feeling about it? Because that's essentially new gender LGBTQ
Yep.
relations or gender relations that are very different than what we saw in the past.
Totally. And I think you're right. I actually I have a Substack for anyone who's interested called
Oh yeah,
Eleanor's
please
Horrors.
please
Here, I'll
promote.
throw that in the chat right now in case anybody
Sure.
is curious. Eleanor's Horrors dot substack.com. I have a post from about a year ago that's about the HBO zombie series The Last of Us.
Oh yeah.
And what you just said is very much what I talk about. Like, that's a zombie show that's actually about love and resistance and survival and what it is to be in a family. That's what that show is about, period. Like, the zombies are incidental. Yeah, they're scary and whatever, but really, it's about Joel and Ellie and their relationship, period, full stop. And the fact that they're not a standard family, right? And in fact, my favorite episode in that entire series is a one-off about where Nick Offerman plays this gay man who finds a lover in the wasted apocalyptic landscape of this post-zombie infestation world. And it's just this one-off episode about how you forge intimacy amid ruination,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I agree with you that that
The
kind of
survivalists, the survivalists in Massachusetts. Yeah.
totally, totally. It's survivalist, that's right. And but it's survivalist not just in a material sense, it's also about emotion, right? It's about like how do you make love and connection in a world that's like this world? How do you do it, right? So I think that that is definitely happening, and I that's another subgenre that I think we're going to see more and more of. And I expect to see more and more that are focused on how children survive, on how kids make it in the world. Because, right now, one of the more interesting social crises that we're facing is that we've got a generation of teenagers between maybe 13 and 20. These are kids who have not grown up at baseline feeling safe. These are kids who are like little during COVID. They're hyper aware of climate collapse. They're hyper aware that the government doesn't seem to make a lot of sense anymore. They're hyper aware of these like ongoing wars. They're like, I felt pretty safe as a kid most of the time. I probably wasn't. I grew up in the 80s and things were fucked up then too. But like this generation has so much access to information. They're so steeped in information that I think we're going to start seeing more films about like kids that are in a kind of
Oh yeah.
survivalist mode
Oh yeah.
without any adults present. So we've seen a little bit of that. And again, the Stranger Things franchise is partially a meditation on that. But I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward. I also expect to see more horror that is about the collapse of the idea of the nation state. So, like horror narratives in which the alliances that are forged cross national and geographic boundaries, and in which that's like a precondition for survival.
Right. No, those are very good points because when I'm always around the Gen Zs, I always
Yeah.
tell them, look, this situation right now you guys are living with through is just as fucked up as the 60s was. It's a
Mhm.
60s kind of thing you're living through. But let's get to the book.
Yep.
Now, explain to us your choices in the movies and why you made them. And, because obviously, again, art reflects the time. So I
Mhm.
sort of read it. I said, okay, that's cool. I didn't know Rosemary's Baby had an intimate relationship with the debate about abortion, but that was a new thing to me. So just share your insights into what you discovered and how'd you come to do this?
Yeah, so like you said before, I'm trained as a medievalist. I started teaching horror because I started teaching early horror. Like I was teaching Dante's Inferno as horror, and then it could, my interest kind of like blurted out from there. But in 2022, I was teaching another history of horror class, not quite the one you took, Jim, but another related one. And I was teaching the movie Rosemary's Baby. And I taught Rosemary's Baby the way that I always teach it and the way that I think about it, which is as a really interesting thought experiment with what happens when women are denied reproductive autonomy. Because really, Rosemary gets raped and impregnated by Satan in that film. And it's able to happen because her husband kind of bawds her out to the neighbors. We all probably know this. But the long and short of it is she is forced to become pregnant with a pregnancy whose origins she doesn't know and that she wouldn't have wanted had she known the origins. And then she's coerced and controlled into having like an especially excruciating version of a pregnancy by these like malicious doctors, the malicious neighbors, her malicious husband. And then she gives birth to this baby that, had she known what it really was, she wouldn't have wanted it, right? So it's very much a film about reproductive control and coercion. And so I taught it in that light. And I focused a lot on a scene that happens in the sort of in the middle of the movie when Rosemary has her friends over for a party and the women kind of sequester themselves and lock themselves symbolically into the kitchen, like the sine qua non of domestic space, right? They lock themselves in there, they bar out Rosemary's husband, Guy, and they start to talk about whether Rosemary will or will not have an abortion. So it's a film that explicitly talks about abortion. And what's interesting is, that film was released in 68 based on a novel that was released in 67. Abortion was not legal in the city or state of New York or any other part of the United States in 1967 and 1968. And so I taught my students like this is a film that's right ahead of like the real heat of the reproductive rights movements in the 1970s, and it's theorizing horror as denying women their reproductive agency. And part of what's powerful about that film to me is that the result, right? It's not just that like Rosemary's life sucks now, which does. It's that she gives birth to the Antichrist. So the novel and the film Rosemary's Baby are making a claim that denying a woman reproductive autonomy is actually bad for everyone, right? Like it's not just hard on her, although it is hard on her. It's bad for everybody. And so I taught that film from that vantage point. And the next day, the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade was leaked, which obviously I did not know was coming down the pike. But when I heard that, I was like, well, I guess I know what I'm working on for the foreseeable future because this shit is an emergency. So I had a semester off and I decided I would just like think and read and research and consider whether I wanted to do a longer project. Initially, it was going to be just about Rosemary's Baby and the history of reproductive choice in New York and in the United States. So I researched that topic and I drafted it all out as a chapter. And then I started to wonder, like, Rosemary's Baby is also very much about domestic violence in a way that wouldn't have been labeled that way in the 1960s. Like in the 1960s, the phrase domestic violence did not exist, right? When anybody talked about it at all, they called it wife battery, and it was understood to be exclusively about physical assault. Like that was the only discursive option if you were going to talk about cruelty of a husband to a wife in the 1960s was to talk about battery, and you would mean physical battery. But the movie Rosemary's Baby is very much about psychological, emotional, and sexual torture. Different. There's one scene when Guy gets physical with Rosemary, but it isn't really a scene of battery. He kind of grabs her and shakes her while she's pregnant, which is super effed up, but like, okay. So I started thinking like that movie is really it's about the relationship between certain kinds of psychological abuse and reproductive coercion. I wonder if there are other movies from the same period that are really squarely about what we now call domestic violence. And I sort of immediately was like, The Exorcist is kind of about that. So I went and rewatched it with that kind of lens fitted to my eye, and like the whole movie just like discloses itself as being about that topic, right? Chris McNeil's life is essentially like interrupted when this malign male demonic force, allegory city, enters her home and begins sexually and physically assaulting her and her daughter. And they can't extricate themselves, even though they go to the police. The police can't really help. They go to the doctors. Doctors can't really help. And by this point, I already knew enough about the history of the criminalization of domestic violence to know that this was the like flow of logic that would happen to someone who was being victimized by domestic battery in the 1970s. You'd go to the police, and typically they wouldn't help you, mostly because it's not because the police were averse to helping. It's because the laws were not robust enough. And there wasn't a lot that the cops could actually do. And I have read a lot of case reports from the 1970s written by police who felt a range of things, including powerless,
Mm.
right? Like, well, we went and he beat her up again. There's not a lot we can do. They're married, blah, blah, blah. And then you'd go to your doctor and you'd say, I'm getting the shit kicked out of me at home. And if you read like best practice medical and psychiatric journals from the early 1970s, best practice was to encourage the women to stay because the medical and psychiatric belief was that any woman who was in an abusive marriage wanted it. The going narrative was that women who were being beaten were masochistic.
Mm.
Now that is crazy. And we know now that that is capital C crazy. Like that's bad practice. But it wasn't until the mid 1970s that clinicians started to realize that that was crazy. And The Exorcist, the film The Exorcist, came out on December 26, 1973, which is like literally months ahead of the moment at which there started to be more battered women shelter in the United States, more laws to protect women from domestic battery in the home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at it's basically like The Exorcist comes out at the end of 73, and it's in 74 and 75 that the battered women's movement exploded across the United States. And that laws started changing, policing norms started changing, medical standards and practices started changing, psychiatric standards and practices started changing. It was like, boom. So you said, Jim, and I agree with this, that art reflects what's going on in a culture. But part of what I wanted to get at and Scream with me is that art, when it's really good, can also accelerate what's going on in a culture.
Mm,
So like the anti-battered women, the movement to raise consciousness about battered women was already like percolating in 1971, 1972, but it was pretty quiet.
mm,
And then it just bang in like late 73 through 75. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that men, women, children, everybody was going and watching The Exorcist, which was on the silver screens in public for 104 consecutive weeks. And they were seeing this woman who had done literally nothing wrong just
mm,
be brutalized by this like demonic male who lived in her home. They watched her be unable to protect her child, though she desperately wanted to. That is a tragic reality for many domestic abuse survivors, right? They're unable to keep their children safe. So then I sort of wrote out a chapter about The Exorcist. And then I was like, oh, that went well. Like, that's something. I wonder what else I could say. Like, are there? And so I just started thinking around and watching stuff. And I eventually rewatched The Stepford Wives, and I was like, oh yeah, this movie's also about domestic violence. It's also about coercion, and it's also kind of really explicit in its thinking through of the women's rights movement. So I watched it a bunch of times, and I started to think that maybe it was an exploration of the Equal Rights Amendment. And I went and looked at the novel that that film is based on, and the novel is more explicit even than the film that it is about those things. So then I wrote a chapter about the Equal Rights Amendment and the Stepford Wives, and it kind of just evolved from there. And then once I was at that point in the analysis, I was like, all right, so domestic dehumanization is like at the center of what I'm looking at, whether it's happening through battery, sexual assault, denying someone's equal rights. It's really about dehumanization in the home
mm,
of women. And as soon as I thought that, I was like, well, I should go rewatch The Shining, right? Because like, who's more dehumanized in a domestic setting than Wendy Torrance? It's like short list. So I rewatched that, and I had a lot to say about that. And then the outlier film in some ways for me was Alien, right? Because Alien isn't, it doesn't really look like it's like a domestic film. But if you watch it thinking about the domos, the home, it really does work that way, right? The ship's name is Mother. The character Dallas functions as the father figure, right? And he's like not able to prevent the threat from entering into the household. And the threat is this like alien, this other
mm,
species that comes in and attacks them all. The name of the ship is the Nostromo, and like nostos or like it's the root of nostalgia. Nostalgia means an aching for home. Nostos is Greek for home or for home-like, right? So yeah, it's the Nostromo. If that's a Joseph Conrad reference, it doesn't change the fact that lexically the name of the ship is like home. So that film is doing a lot of thinking about like how can we expand our definition of what the home is and of what the family can look like to think about domestic abuse and of course reproductive coercion, which is what that film is about, right? That's a film in which everybody can get raped and everybody can get impregnated, including the men. So that film is thinking about the same dynamics that animate Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, but in outer space where it's a free for all in terms of gender. It doesn't matter if you're female, you're getting knocked up as long as you have an esophagus in that film, right? So that film was the one that surprised me, but the more I watched it and thought about it and read about what was going on politically at the time, the more I realized that it actually was part of the same conversation. So it was very piecemeal, very kind of like I just followed the scent as I went along, though I had decided early on in the project that I was only in this particular book. This isn't true of the book that's coming out this fall, but of this book, I decided I was only going to look at mainstream cinema. And the reason for that was that I wanted to make claims about like films that really had the power to like shift cultural discourse.
mm,
And it's easier to make that claim when you know that tens of millions of people saw a film or that a film was available to be seen. This is, of course, before, home video, whatever. That like Rosemary's Baby was on the screen for a year, The Exorcist for 2 years, right? And Alien was like on screens kind of again and again and again in serialization. So these films were enormously popular in their time. The of them, The Stepford Wives was probably like the least box office success, but it became a cult classic real fast, partially because of the cast, right? Like Paula Prentice and Catherine Ross. So that's kind of how I picked the films. And again, like I have thought, and I actually did watch a whole lot of B-list movies from this era too, and they have a lot of interesting stuff to say. I think a person could write a book about like cult films from this period and what they were saying and
Oh,
doing.
yeah, absolutely.
But I sort of executively decided that I wanted to talk only in this book about films that I could really say had a big impact on mass culture.
Now you threw The Omen in this mix too, right?
Yes, that's right.
How did that play into it?
The Omen, I wanted to do that one, or I decided to rewatch it because it's such a clear, it's a reboot of Rosemary's Baby. It was reviewed at the time as kind of a reboot of Rosemary's Baby. But I remembered from it that the protagonist is male. And I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to look at a film that's about violence in the home and this antichrist stuff and reproductive coercion where you're supposed to like the male protagonist who's played by Gregory Peck. Who doesn't like Gregory Peck? So I watched the movie kind of with that in mind, and it's really interesting. If you watch that movie thinking about reproductive coercion and control, the whole movie feels really different because the opening scene, if anybody hasn't seen it or doesn't remember, the opening scene just shows Gregory Peck, who plays Robert Thorne, talking to a priest about the fact that his wife, Gregory Peck's wife, has just lost their baby. The baby was stillborn. And the priest convinces Gregory Peck to tell his wife, tell his own wife, that her baby has survived and to raise this foundling child who winds up being Damien the Antichrist as if it's her own. So the opening scene of the film it's exactly about reproductive coercion, right? And the Gregory Peck character explicitly says in the opening scene of that film, Kathy didn't want to adopt a child. She always wanted her own. So he says out loud what he knows she wanted, and he decides to jettison it completely and totally lie to her about her baby and or about the baby and whose it is and whatever. And then as the film wears on, Kathy years later winds up in psychiatric treatment because she has a delusion that Damien is not her baby. And even at that point, Gregory Peck's character, Robert Thorne, does not disclose the truth. Even when Kathy's psychotherapist talks to him and says, oh, Kathy's really unwell. She has this delusion that the baby's not really her baby. Robert's kind of like, mm-hmm. And he could have said something, right? He could have exonerated her in the eyes of her own psychotherapist, right? Meanwhile, the psychiatrist thinks she's psychotic, but in fact, she's right. Okay. And so when I watched that film thinking about these dynamics, I was like, my God, this film is totally about the same stuff, except for the very important dynamic that Robert Thorne is basically a nice guy and we like him and he's the protagonist. And so, actually, in some ways, of all the books I look at in Scream with Me, The Omen, I don't want to say it's the smartest, but it's subtle because what it's doing is it's getting people in 1975, 1976 to think about how well-meaning men could nevertheless be sort of complicit in fatal domestic violence toward a woman, even if they never raise their hands against her, which Robert never does, never would, right? That character. But by gaslighting her, by reproductively controlling her, by denying her access to reality, sweet, lovable Gregory Peck manages to kill a woman indirectly. And how are we going to feel about that, right? So that's a film that's asking us as viewers to think about how benign patriarchs can nevertheless be complicit in violence against women, even if it is not what they want to do, not what they believe in, would never. I often think of Hamlet when I think of the Omen. There's a great line in Hamlet when Hamlet's mother says to Hamlet, I would not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly, meaning like nothing in heaven or earth could make me ever hit your mother, right? He says to Hamlet. That's Gregory Peck to Kathy. He would never, for heaven or earth, raise a hand against her. But on some level, in his like desire to prevent her from knowing the truth of her baby's death, his like benign desire to protect her psychologically, he winds up indirectly bringing about her untimely death.
Interesting, brilliant. It's very funny when you bring up The Exorcist. I always think of the first time I used to have Gilda Radner as a client,
Oh my God.
and she lived in the Dakota. So the first time I went into the Dakota, I said, "Where is the basement? I don't want to go into the basement." And we laughed about that. But what's interesting in listening and reading your analysis is I go back. It brings me back to the days of yesteryears, because thinking about women I knew who were going into rap groups in the early 70s. Uh,
Mhm.
my former sister-in-law was a woman who helped founded the woman's law firm. So she
Hmm.
was mounting class action lawsuits. And so I was always around people involved in these struggles. And what's so fascinating to listen to you to read the book was I'm saying to myself, as much as I believe in how films essentially convey and socialize us,
Hmm.
I wasn't thinking about these movies in the way you were, because
Hmm.
at the time, that these actually were reflecting these divisions that we were experiencing. Now, take this story to the present, because you
Yeah.
finished this book. Before I bring in other people to comment about this, you, you talk about movies that have come into the lexicon of cinema in the past 20 years. So, how do these films juxtapose with what you've talked about before with these six movies?
Yeah, so the I look at a bunch of films from the 21st century, but I guess in the interest of time, the three I'll mention now all came out in 2024 and are explicit either prequels or sequels or remakes of Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, or The Omen. And those films are Apartment 7A, which is a prequel to Rosemary's Baby, explicitly a prequel to Rosemary's Baby. The First Omen, which is a prequel to The Omen, as the title would indicate. And the movie Immaculate, which stars Sydney Sweeney. And it's kind of like, it's sort of like a reboot of Rosemary's Baby and The Omen. And in some ways, also The Exorcist kind of mashed up together. And I thought to myself, oh, look at that. 2 years post Dobbs, we've got three movies that are rebooting horror films from the 70s that are all about reproductive coercion and violence. And all three of those, 2024 films, again, Apartment 7A, The First Element, and Immaculate, they're all extremely explicitly about reproductive coercion, reproductive control, forced pregnancy, and in two of the three cases, the complicity of the Catholic Church in supporting and sustaining that kind of reproductive control and coercion. And in one case, it's about the Satanists in the Dakota again. So when Dobbs happened, I immediately was like, oh, we're going to see a lot of pregnancy horror in the next few years. And indeed we have, right? And it's been th those pregnancy horror films have very much leveraged the 1970s precedents, like on purpose, clearly as prequels and sequels and whatever, to kind of get traction in the dynamics that we're in now. And I think, again, one of the things that there are many things I find upsetting about our current political moment. But definitely one of them is from a women's rights standpoint, we've regressed 50 years in like a year, 2 years maybe. And I'm immensely concerned about it. And I'm pleased that filmmakers in Hollywood and elsewhere are also immensely concerned about it and are making films that are like, oh my God, we should all be doing more to protect women's rights. So those three films came out in 24 and are like sort of carrying the banner forward.
All right, very good. So folks who have comments or questions to Eleanor, please do that. Raise your hand thing, and just jump in there. Alex, do you have a comment or question? You just have to unmute, Alex. Oh, Michael, yeah, go on, Alex.
No, no, I just will wait for Mike to go first.
Okay, go on, Mike. You have to unmute.
Yeah, I did. Well, let me start this off. Excuse me. Let me start this off by saying I don't consider most films to be art. Entertainment, yes, not really art, and certainly not high art. Um, so comparing, let's say, Casablanca to what I call the real film version of West Side Story or the original West Side Story, or for that matter, something like Citizen Kane, is like comparing Donald Trump to Albert Einstein. You can't lump all these things under the category of art. That
Mhm.
being said, if we go back even further in the period that you're saying, there were films that at least approached art. One of them um, was directed by Robert Wise, who co-directed West Side Story, which is called The Haunting.
Mhm.
And it was done from a female point of view.
Mhm.
So, two of the main characters, one in particular, played by Richard Johnson, was a main character. It was done from the female point of view.
Mhm.
It also, there were two female leads in it, and the other female was probably the first time that it was where there was a, shall we say, more explicitly denoted lesbian character.
Mhm.
Uh, so it was a breakthrough film on that level. And it did make money. And I should also say that um, the problem is that in order for a film to have an effect, it has to reach a wide audience, which means it has to make a lot of money. Um, so that's a problem with a lot of films, such it was with The Night of the Hunter. And in The Night of the Hunter, the only adult protagonist who was positive, who was sympathetic, was female.
Mm-hmm.
And even though more of a mother image, because it was like a fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at this, then wouldn't you say, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at these films. I
I've
mean,
seen
Oh, she sure has.
yeah, and I would say, and for reproductive rights, although not from the female point of view, I guess the classic would be the adaptation of John Wyndham's novel, which came out as Village of the Damned in 1960, which is a denial of female
Mhm.
reproductive rights
Mm.
in an extreme sense. But the idea is that there were these strong female characters
Yep.
that were coming through, and I think that, in other words, the emboldening or emboldenment, whatever, emboldening of a female character, and making the audience identify
Mm-hmm.
and see things from the perception of the female character was actually happening long before this
Yeah, no question.
period. And what would your feelings be about films like that, the ones I mentioned?
Well, I mean, since forever, there have been narratives that put a woman at the center of the audience's empathy, right? Chaucer's Wife of Bath from the Canterbury Tales is a great
Sure.
locus classicus to go to for that, or for Pete's sake, like Othello, right? I think you start reading Othello and you're like, oh, Othello's good. By the end, you're like, oh God, come back, Desdemona, right? Like there's a big shift that happens there, and Shakespeare's interested in looking at that. So I'm not at all trying to say that there were no female protagonists before 1968. That's completely erroneous. Not, nor even that there's no female protagonists in horror. Because there are some. I don't know that I would, I mean, like, I have mixed feelings about whether I would put some of those films in the horror genre. I probably would, at the end of the day, put most of them in the horror genre. I mean, The Haunting, definitely. But in the book Scream With Me, and the films I'm talking about, I see those as in a particular subgenre of horror, which is what I call domestic horror. And domestic horror, I like define it in the book as having certain predictable, consistent characteristics. The Haunting doesn't have them. Night of the Hunter doesn't have them. Village of the Damned doesn't have them. That doesn't mean that there aren't other horror subgenres that are interested in women, interested in women's experience. Totally. But I'm looking at like a particular manifestation that kind of keeps happening around horror really acutely between 68 and 80. I do, though, think there's a precedent in that genre that's much older than any of these other films. And Jim, you probably know where I'm going with this because you took my class. But the movie Gaslight from 1944, that really is the first like clear domestic horror film that I feel like it like fulfills all the criteria of the genre that I see as being operative in them. The trick with that film, of course, is that it's not a total slam dunk that it is horror. It has the traits of domestic horror, but usually people classify Gaslight as a thriller. And the reason for that is that there's a resolution at the end, right? The bad guy, jewel thief dude gets caught, and it's all like the threat is expiated, and there is no need for a horror hangover because the world is kind of righted once again. And also because, unlike in all of the later movies I look like, and indeed and at least some of the horror films that you cited from the 60s, earlier films from the 60s, usually those horror films usually have a supernatural element to them. Not always, like the sort of sociopath horror genre, which is where I would locate Night of the Hunter. There's not always a supernatural element in horror, but there usually is. Like, usually when people talk about horror, they're invoking some degree of supernaturalism, and that's definitely present in The Haunting, not so much present in Night of the Hunter, definitely present in Village of the Damned, and not present in Gaslight. But even so, I feel like if I were to say like that's the point of origin in terms of cinema history for domestic horror, I would put it in Gaslight, which I don't talk about in my book at all because the sort of like I'm starting the beginning of the history in the book in 1968. But if I wanted to do like a preface on that movie, I could have done that and I thought about doing it. So I agree with you both that there are strong female leads in horror prior to this moment, and even that like domestic horror as a thinkable thought predates 1968 by 20 years or so. The trick is that it's not it's not totally clear that Gaslight was meant as a horror film or really received as a horror film so much as a thriller and really as a crime thriller in effect. But your larger point that like the protagonist, strong female protagonists are everywhere, that's definitely true. Although it is also true that if you were to look at like number of female protagonists per film, that ratio has gone up a lot in like since the late 1960s in particular. Like we've just been like, whoop. And now like we're catching up in another way, which is that we're having more female directors make films. And as that happens, more and more female protagonists, particularly in horror, are visible and strong and whatever. Your other point about like, where do you draw the line around what art is? I probably have a slightly wider catchment than you do for what I would say qualifies as art. And that may be because of my training as a medievalist, right? Like, if we wanted to sort of say that the only art worthy of study is like the best of the best of the best of the best of the best, we'd miss a lot of like medieval literary history, medieval poetic history, medieval dramatic history. Some of my favorite medieval works are sort of like flop adjacent, and I still think of them as art. But again, that has to do with like where you want to draw the perimeter around art and how you want to say like what qualifies and what doesn't. But it's a good question.
Interesting.
Well, I certainly don't want to get into a discussion of the definitions of art. I don't think that would be a misutilization of our time. But and I do want to say that there were, in other words, I don't want to paint it myself as an elitist here. I mean, I watched Gorgo, and that had a strong female, somewhat sympathetic protagonist, but unfortunately, she was a dinosaur. Yeah, yeah. So that was there's schlock. There's some value to schlock also.
Totally.
But yeah.
That's a whole other discussion, Mike.
I know. That's why I don't want to get into it. So thank you.
All right. Anyway, go on, Aaron. You have to unmute Aaron.
Sorry about that. No, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Jim, for putting this together. And by the way, if everyone doesn't know, your Substack is phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
Really amazing, actually.
Thank you.
And so I did want to ask you. I mean, obviously, you have a whole bunch of other movies that you could classify. How do you view, because obviously there's the Alien track. How do you view as a big Terminator fan, my cousin was actually in Terminator 2. She was in the opening scene, the punk girl when Arnold's naked going into the bar. Yeah, that's my cousin Debbie.
Hilarious.
Yeah, no, it really. And then to make it even crazier, she dated Franco Columbo for 3 years, actually, who is Arnold's best friend. But anyway, so what is your view of how Sarah Connor fits in, because her evolution from, oh no, poor cute little girl to, arguably humanoid Terminator, like,
Totally.
as a protagonist, like actually she's sort of scarier than the Terminators now.
Yeah.
So how do you view her evolution and just the Terminator franchise, even though it's not classified as horror? I mean,
No,
but
it should
it's
be.
like, it's right. Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah,
It's near
totally.
there.
It's
It's
a great
sci-fi
question.
horror, almost sci-fi horror.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and I love that question. I'm obsessed with that franchise
Good.
also for different reasons
I
and
can
different.
connect you to Debbie, so she knows all those people. They're still friends. They get together
Oh my
every so
God.
often.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
I'd love that.
yeah.
I actually
Absolutely.
I've just started, well, I'm almost done with it, but I'm working on a book about zombies, as I mentioned before, and there's a chapter in it about the Terminator franchise because I think the Terminator films are best understood as like tech zombie apocalypse films.
Yeah,
That's my
that's
hot
awesome.
take on the genre. And if you sort of look at the films with that lens in your eye, you'll be like, oh yeah, totally works that way. Um, and partially it's because like the whole like you can't kill the Terminator. That's the thing with zombies. Like you try to kill the zombie, but you can't kill the zombie, and you keep thinking you're killing the zombie, but you're never really killing the zombie. Same thing with the Terminator. I'll be back. Okay. So Sarah Connor, I would put her in the same sort of channel as any protagonist who's surviving a zombocalypse because it is an apocalypse movie. The first one is a particularly interesting apocalypse movie because it anticipates the apocalypse. Like almost all destruction of world narratives take place after the event, and except for the opening sequence, like the entire first Terminator movie predates by a lot. Well, now we're getting close to it, July 2029. Buckle your safety belts, y'all. But anyway, so Sarah Connor is like a survivor of in effect a tech zombocalypse, right? That's what she's done. So she's like the what's his name, Pedro Pascal character from The Last of Us. And I think like him, she has to go through a hardening. Usually in zombocalypse film, the protagonist starts out, she is unusually, I don't want to call her weak. She's unusually unprepared for the whole thing. Usually the survivor of the apocalypse has some preformed train, like ex-cop or former veteran or a farmer. Like think of The Walking Dead, the cop who survives that character. Usually there's some she starts at zero, which I think is important to the political logic of that film, because what that film is sort of saying is like, we are living in a moment when our governments have like lost the thread. They've lost the plot on how to caretake people. They're outsourcing too much of their intel and power to machines. And as I sit here in the like dawn of the AI era, I find like every time I think about AI, I'm thinking about the Terminators. Like that's my next thought every time. And that film, the original one, is sort of saying, like, in the event that we sort of lose control of humanity to the machines, even like the weakest and least prepared among us has to become like hard and tough and steely and ready, because it's going to be an emergency for everybody. And it's going to be a total take no prisoner situation. So that film, I think, shows an enormous amount of optimism about the role that anyone could play, but particularly that women could play in the apocalypse, by saying, like, it doesn't matter where you start. If you have the information and you have a lot of heart, you can get to be the Sarah Connor of the second film, who, as you rightly alluded to, is freaking terrifying, right? She's awesome. She's like deadlifting in her prison cell. Um, and I think that that film is trying to model a certain kind of survivorship
Mm.
and is trying to center it in women. And one of the other interesting things I think, particularly in the second movie, is that at it, well, it's alluded to in the first movie too. The thing that makes Sarah Connor able to become this like is the fact that she becomes a mother.
Mm.
So it's a film that associates what is usually ascribed as like a core weakness of women, which is their reproductive life. It converts that into a strength. Everything in the second film is about like, to the extent that humanity is savable, it's because this woman had a baby that she loves
Mm.
with a man that she loved from the future. Time paradox, right? So it's a film that sees what is usually construed as women's like unique vulnerability as the precondition for the survival of the human species, which just on a biological level is, of course, true, right? Like women do have to give birth if the species is going to continue. So I think that film has a really interesting read on how women are in some ways uniquely suited to survive some kind of apocalypse, both because they're not starting strong, but they can get real strong. And also because, like, what better impulse is there to try and save things than wanting to keep your child alive for a woman? I can't think of a better impulse than that. So I think it's a great question. And I think that's another genre we're going to see more of. And in fact, the zombie film I alluded to before, The Girl with All the Gifts, which is a great film, has tangency with the Terminator along these lines. Like the protagonist is a little girl, and she has a sort of adoptive mother figure who's sort of the co-protagonist. And she's not in a Sarah Connor role. Well, she is. You should watch it. She is a
Yeah.
teacher.
Oh,
She's
oh,
a
thank
teacher.
you.
And so
Uh,
anyway,
and, and if I can have one little quick follow-up before Lily is what's your perspective on Predator? Because I'm a huge Predator fan, and this interesting dynamic in the Predator films where, in essence, the women survive and fight and often defeat or at least sustain, and there's a whole, subgenre in the Junta, that's their language,
yeah,
society of female predators, which they haven't broken them out yet because they're supposed to be even scarier than the male ones. And so,
yeah.
what's your perspective on the Predator?
Yeah, I'm a little less fluent in the Predator franchise than in others, but I've seen several of those movies. And I remember when I saw the first Predator movie being like, oh, they should do like a cross branding with Alien. And then of course that happened. Because for me, like the franchise that I know better, which is analogous in the terms is of course Alien, where the like real scary monster is revealed to be this parthenogenetic female alien whose primary mechanism of whelping terror is in fact whelping out a bunch of eggs, which then hatch into presumably other female aliens, right? So it seems to be a species that's all women and they're super scary. And in the second Alien movie, you get that great scene when Ripley's holding Newt, right? Her like de facto adoptive daughter. and facing the alien mother who's protecting all of her alien daughters. And they have this tense standoff.
Right.
Ripley's kind of like, are we doing this? And the alien mother's like, I'll back off if you back off. The scene that I find so interesting in that is that Ripley stupidly then turns around and torches the eggs, right? And it's then that the mother alien's like, well, now we have to fight, right? So it's a fascinating thing. So I think that the Alien and Predator franchises are both thinking about female power and female monstrosity in really interesting and sophisticated ways, and sometimes in ways that are super schlocky and weird too. Like some of the later
Yeah.
Alien movies get a little like shark jumpy
Well, it's
around.
money grabs at that point, but yeah, yeah,
Yeah, exactly, around these issues. But I actually do think that both the Predator franchise and the Alien franchise have in common not just thinking about females and women as uniquely resistant and powerful, Ripley and some of the survivors in Predator, and as the monsters as uniquely terrifying because female. So I think they have that stuff hugely in common. And they're also, I think, doing some interesting work, which I'd love to think about more. And if I wrote one article about this in Public Books film section a couple years ago, they're also thinking about indigeneity in pretty interesting ways, right? Like you can look at the Alien franchise and say, like, well,
hmm
really, this is a settler colonialist horror film in which
Yep.
Weyland-Yutani is a settler colonialist franchise, and the indigenous aliens, right, a term we use to abuse indigenous peoples now in various countries, like the aliens fight back more effectively than they did in history. So it's very, very interesting to look at those films with a sort of indigenous studies lens in your
Oh,
eye.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
and when you kind of crossfade that with the gender thing, it gets
Mm,
really interesting.
yeah.
And like I said, I've thought about this a lot more in the Alien franchise than I have in Predator, but I'd be eager to do more thinking along those lines. So if you want to chat more, you can drop me an email.
Thank
Yeah.
you, thank you.
I think the Battlestar Galactica, the new series, is very interesting along those lines.
Oh,
Go on,
yeah.
Lily. Go on, Lily.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. My friend Erin brought me into it last minute, and I just love this
Oh, great.
conversation. It's great, so I appreciate it. I'm a little nervous about talking, but last year when I was vacationing with my husband and my sister and my cousin, we were having a conversation about what our favorite type of supernatural, and it was kind of I feel like it's almost kind of very telling about personalities. I love witches. I'm all everything kind of witch genre. I'm always interested in books and movies in that area. And my husband and my sister like zombies, and my cousin like vampires. And I've always struggled to like vampire type genre type films and television and books, and they're extremely popular, as we know. And I was kind of curious to hear if you thought that there was. I'm really fascinated by your insights on it, kind of impact on culture. But like we went through kind of a vampire phase where there was a lot of vampire movies and fictions in popularity, and that seemed to die down, and we saw a lot of zombie
Yep.
stuff coming through. And I wonder if you kind of have mapped that against kind of cultural things as well. And then the second question that I had was I haven't heard you bring it up, but it was a movie. It's now a popular television show, but The Handmaid's Tale. I
Oh,
don't know if
yeah.
you count that as a horror, but
I
certainly that
would.
has played very close. It has had a huge
Mm,
impact in society last during this Trump administration. I mean, they're
Yes.
wearing the costumes and whatnot. So I just want to hear your insights on that. Thank you. I'm going to
Yeah.
buy your book after this.
Oh, thanks. Yay. And thanks so much for those great questions. First, briefly, Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, it's a bummer when horror anticipates actual political reality as closely as happened there. That's like a real poor outcome. Um, and it's also a fascinating roadmap for how horror can be used for political resistance. Now we've got all these protests with women in the Handmaid's Tale garb, and like the iconic power of that is really hard to discount and hard to look away from. So I think Atwood's novel has given women an interesting playbook for resistance in this moment, and I'm grateful for that. To your sort of larger question, which is a great one. So one of the books I'm writing right now, Monstrous Bitch, which is coming out with Princeton in October of 26, talks a lot about vampires and vampirism, and it is in some ways it's a partially distinct genre from the zombie genre, even though what vampires and zombies, of course, have in common is both are horror about the undead, right? The idea that a thing
Right,
can die and not actually be dead. And that's pretty scary, right? And in one case, it takes the form of a vampire, which is undead but retains its soul, retains its personality, retains its being. The only difference is that, anatomically its heart doesn't pump anymore. And that's like a vampire.
right,
versus zombies, where the thing dies and it comes back without a soul. It comes back as a husk or a body, right? And that's kind of the definition of the zombie as distinct from the vampires. One comes back with the soul and is cannibalistic, predatory, blood-sucking. The other comes back without a soul, cannibalistic, predatory, blood-sucking. So I think people who are more scared of zombies and find that genre more compelling are really interested on some deep heart affect level, are interested in, like, at what point is a person not a person anymore? Like, when do we have the total decay of human self into something else, like into beast, animal, flesh, meat, etc. So
Well,
that's
that's
a
interesting. So it's like kind of like the theory of the heap, just like at what point do we stop becoming human, kind of thing. I mean, I always assumed that was kind of more apocalyptic, but that's an interesting
I think I
take on
think
it.
I think it is apocalyptic, and I think that's part of why the zombie genre so often goes toward apocalypse. Like, many
Right.
zombie film are also apocalyptic. Vampire films are never apocalyptic, right?
Yeah.
The mechanism of violence in a vampire film is always one-on-one. That's like almost a mandate of the once in a blue moon, it'll be like 1-on-2 or 2-on-1, but it's never a horde. You don't get hordes, right?
Mhm.
Zombies, it's all about hordes. So I think that the apocalypse mode is more typical of the zombie genre. It doesn't really happen in vampires. There's also an interesting class difference. The vampire genre is almost always aristocratic. Vampires are usually fancy, rich, posh, whatever, often French. Um,
Yeah.
and zombies, it's a, for lack of a better term, it's a democratizing form of horror. Everybody is subject to the threat in the same way, at the same time, in the same scale, and by the same mechanism, right? If you don't cross paths with a rich aristocrat, you're not going to get eaten by a vampire. In a zombie narrative, it's like everybody. So the type of fear that zombie apocalypse evokes is less discriminate, generally more grotesque, and much more about the radical collapse of the category of the human. Vampirism is more about this question of whether there is some element of the human that's retained, right? So my favorite vampire narrative, and if you don't like vampire narratives, I very strongly recommend you go read. It's available online for free. Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novella Carmilla. It's about a
Okay.
female lesbian vampire, and it's a fascinating novella because it's extremely erotic, very beautiful, very scary, and it's all about like the nature of female eros around vampirism. So the vampire genre often includes some element of the erotic, some element of the transgressive erotic, and that's
Right. Yeah. I
rare.
was good. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No,
That's what I was going to bring it up. I so much of what I see it is kind of a sexual kink that's kind
that's
of,
right. And that is
yeah.
absent from the zombie genre. Like zombies,
Right.
I really would not watch a zombie sex movie. That's gross. There is a spoof movie that's actually very funny called Zombie Strippers. It's old, it's really hard to find. I saw it in the theaters in the early 2000s. But it's a rare as hen's teeth to get a zombie film that has like a sex dynamic to it. I mean,
There's
it,
actually a teenage one that came out recently that had that kind of
oh really?
it's a rum. Yeah, I'll find out the name of it for
Yeah,
you and
let me
send it if
know.
you like. Yeah.
It was
That'd
I
be
Was
great.
a Teenage Zombie, I think it's called. It's like
Oh, okay.
it's something like
I should
that.
look at
But
that.
one thing that just was raised was the first analytic book I ever read about horror movies was in 1964. It was a completely Freudian analysis
Hmm.
of vampire movies and horror movies. Because when you bring up the Twilight franchise, I mean, I always amuse the hell out of it. Because what is it about eternal love? It's about
Right.
eternal love. And I wanted you to also comment about the Mockingbird franchise. What do you think about
Yeah.
that? And Romero, look, Romero, I lived around the corner where Night of the Living Dead opened up.
Uh-huh.
It
Cool.
opened up at the Sheridan Square movie theater. And back in and as you know, the history of how that happened was it was brought to the attention of by people in MoMA to
Uh-huh.
actually watch because it would be popular in France as opposed to the United States, and that's when Night of the Living Dead opens up. And
I
so
see.
people used to go to the Night of the Living Dead dropping acid, and I'll never forget. I went in there one time, and there were probably people screaming and yelling because they were watching this movie. But then when I saw it, of course, it was a brilliant
Yeah.
satire because as we know, it comes out of March '68 in the middle of the war. Um, but what got me with Romero is the class issues that come up
Yeah,
there.
definitely. Hmm.
Because when I saw Dawn of the Dead, I saw it in a movie theater that doesn't exist anymore on 103rd Street and Broadway. And we were laughing our asses off because the one thing they wanted to go back to was the shopping mall,
The mall.
the
Yeah.
mall. And then
Um,
Day of the Dead is a clear, like the zombies just decide to go in and get rid of the humans who were
right.
you know, the and then that element of these films always fascinates me. And what's your thoughts about that? Because Mockingbird, when you look at the Mockingjay franchise, anarchists out in Brooklyn show the movies as political resistance. It's absolutely fascinating. But
Well, I think that's how she meant them. But first of all, I have to go pick up my children in just a couple minutes. So
okay,
alas, this is going to have to be my last question, but I'm happy to, if anybody wants to email, I'm happy to follow up. But what's it called? The Hunger Games
the
tetralogy.
Hunger Games, yeah,
I think it's great. I mentioned before that I expect to see more apocalypse horror featuring children. That's part of why. Like, I don't think that tetralogy has not run its full sort of like landing strip yet. There's a lot of room to move there. And every kid I know between the ages of like 10 and 20 is obsessed with that franchise.
yeah,
And because they want to be able to imagine a path forward where they survive a broken world that's dominated by a totally and completely classist and corrupt political regime. They see it, they get it, they know that it's an allegory for the United States, which it is. The author has said as much, and they are not missing the memo. So you're totally right on all of that. And I also think you're right about Romero, right? Like, I think, Romero, that franchise the franchise to me, and you know this from my class, Night of the Living Dead, I think, is very much a film about race. It's also about class. It's certainly also about Vietnam. It's about many things.
mm,
As that franchise evolves, it becomes an anti-capitalist screed. And after the first, because he made like six films or maybe even
right,
seven. I've seen six of them. And the first three are all sort of good, and they remain very much about racial dynamics in the United States. Like the protagonist of Night, Dawn, and Day are all black males,
right,
in most cases paired up with a female, a white female. Although she sucks in the first one, Barbara's the worst. But there's a race element that's maintained throughout those first three. And the consumerist element, as you rightly point out, comes in Dawn and stays, although it also becomes like a sort of more clearly an anti-military screed in the third film, Day of the Dead. In the subsequent films in the franchise, Romero comes back to the anti-capitalism and turns the volume way, 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 way up. I forget, Land of the Dead, I think, is the fourth one. That's the one where we're in Pittsburgh and there's like one high rise that's functional, and it's
right,
like very clearly a class critique.
right. The
So
zombies go underwater to get them. Yeah.
that's right. But alas, I'm so sorry, but I really do have to ring off now
All
because
right.
if I'm to pick up my kids, they're going to
All right.
be.
Well, we'll have to do this again.
Yeah, I'd love it.
It's a great pleasure. Here is the book, Scream with Me.
Thanks,
So
Jim.
for all of you out there in TV land, this is the book to go get. And Professor Johnson is coming out with her new book.
Yep.
But we'd like to get you to talk about these issues because I see Mike. Mike, I'm sure, has lots of questions, and we'll have to do this again soon, Eleanor.
Sounds
So
great.
it's great. It's great to talk to you. It's always fun.
Yeah,
And I
you too.
wanna
Thanks so
thank
much,
you
Jim.
so much for participating because we'll bring in some of the old film critics next time
Awesome.
they'd have a lot of fun with this. But I want to thank
Great.
you so much for spending time with
Well,
us today. Go pick up your kids.
okay. Thank you too. Thanks, everyone. Be
All right.
well.
Bye
So
bye.
much.
Cheers.